for the hardest-hitting show in talk radio. The true progressive voice since 2012. This is Southpaws.
And welcome to Southpaws on the Pacifica Radio Network. We are the leaders of the revolution. I'm Darren Gibson, your host. James Crumbley, the father of the Oxford High School shooter, has been found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. We'll tell you the details about that. Trump's having trouble covering his civil fraud judgment. Oh, this may not be good for old Honest Don, as he calls himself. Honest Don, my ass. Oh boy, and we've been going back and forth with the Texas law allowing police to arrest migrants who illegally cross the border. Well, first, the Supreme Court said, go ahead and enforce it. Now, the District Circuit Court of Appeals has said, no, you can't enforce it. So we'll get into the meat of that issue as well. Plus, we've got plenty of other stories to talk about. Before we get started with today's topics, a couple of reminders. You can follow us on social media by going to facebook.com/Southpaws Radio Show. You can follow us on X, the former Twitter, at Southpaws Radio. You can follow us on Tumblr at southpawsradioshow.tumblr.com. You can follow us on YouTube and Mastodon by doing a search for Southpaws Radio. You can become a patron of the show by going to patreon.com/Southpaws Radio. You can listen to the show anytime at Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Podcast Addict, Podvine, and Pandora by doing a search for Southpaws. Once you found our logo, you found us. We are aware that Google Podcast is going away. We are hoping that you switch either to Spreaker or Apple. I know Google's going to be transitioning people, I guess, to YouTube podcasts, but we're actually not a part of that, not that I'm aware of. We do send our link to our YouTube account, as we do every week. We also send our links to our weekly episodes to our Facebook, X, Tumblr, and Mastodon accounts, as well as YouTube, as I just mentioned. You can hear us every Saturday night at 11 on Global Community Radio Channel 1. And you can listen to us on great Pacifica stations, including KCEI in Taos, New Mexico, and KZGM in Kabul, Missouri. Be sure to listen to us on your local Pacifica affiliate. We are recording this show on Wednesday, March 20th, 2024. Let's go ahead to our first story. This is Ed White writing for the Associated Press. This is dated March 14th out of Pontiac, Michigan. The father of a Michigan school shooter was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter Thursday, a second conviction against the teen's parents who were accused of failing to secure a gun at home and doing nothing to address acute signs of his mental turmoil. The jury verdict means that James Crumbley has joined Jennifer Crumbley as a cause of the killing of 4 students at Oxford High School in 2021, even without pulling the trigger. They had separate trials as the first U.S. parents to be charged in a mass school shooting committed by their child. 45-year-old Jennifer Crumbley was convicted of involuntary manslaughter in February. The verdicts, one each for the 4 victims, were read around 7:15 p.m. at the end of a full day of deliberations in Oakland County Court. The 47-year-old James Crumbley, who heard the outcome through headphones because of a hearing problem, slowly shook his head from side to side as the jury foreman said guilty. A sheriff's deputy removed a dress tie from his neck, shackled him at the waist, and returned him to jail. Family of some of the fallen students wept quietly and gripped each other's hands in the second row of the courtroom. Later at a news conference, County Prosecutor Karen McDonald stood next to them and praised their unwavering courage through extraordinary tragedy and grief. McDonald said, quote, "This verdict does not bring back their children, but it does mark a moment of accountability and will hopefully be another step to address and end gun violence." End of quote. Defense attorney Marielle Lehman said that James Crumbley, quote, "obviously feels terrible," end of quote, about what happened at the school. He and his wife each face a possible minimum sentence of as much as 10 years in prison when they return to court April 9th. They actually could receive 40 to 60 if the sentences are run consecutively, not concurrently. Lehman told the Associated Press, quote, while we are disappointed with the verdict, we know that the jury had a very difficult task in front of them, end of quote. Prosecutors focused on two key themes at the trial: the parents' response to a morbid drawing on Ethan Crumbley's math assignment a few hours before the shooting, and the teen's access to a Sig Sauer 9mm handgun purchased by James Crumbley only 4 days earlier. Ethan, who was 15 at the time, made a ghastly drawing of a gun and a wounded man on a math assignment and added disturbing phrases. The thoughts won't stop. Help me, my life is useless. But James and Jennifer Crumbley declined to take Ethan home following a brief meeting at the school, and staff didn't demand it. A counselor concerned about suicidal ideations told them to seek help for the boy within 48 hours. Ethan had told counselor Sean Hopkins that he was sad over the death of his dog and grandmother and the loss of a friend who had abruptly moved away. He said the drawing was simply his jottings for a video game and that he wasn't planning to commit violence. But neither he nor his parents told school officials about the gun they had just bought, according to testimony. Hopkins had hoped Ethan would spend the day with his parents, but when that was ruled out, the counselor felt the teen would probably be safer around others at school. Ethan pulled the Sig Sauer from his backpack and began shooting later that same day, killing 17-year-old Justin Schilling, 17-year-old Madison Baldwin, 14-year-old Hannah St. Juliana, and 16-year-old Tate Meyer. 6 more students and a faculty member were wounded. No one had checked the backpack, though a school administrator had joked about its heaviness. McDonald told the jury Wednesday, quote, James Crumbley is not on trial for what his son did. James Crumbley is on trial for what he did and for what he didn't do, end of quote. She added that he, quote, doesn't get a pass because somebody else, end of quote, actually pulled the trigger. Hopkins told the jury that James Crumbley showed empathy toward his son during the meeting about the drawing but took no additional action. When James Crumbley heard about the shooting, he rushed home from his DoorDash job and looked for the gun. In a frantic 911 call, he said, quote, I think my son took the gun, end of quote. Investigators found an empty gun case and an empty ammunition box on the parents' bed. A cable that could have locked the gun was still in a package unopened. Ethan told the judge when he pleaded guilty to murder and terrorism that the gun was not locked when he stuffed it in his backpack. Defense attorney Lehman tried to emphasize to jurors that James Crumbley did not consent to any gun access by his son. She said, quote, he did not know he had to protect others from his son. He had no idea what his son was planning to do, end of quote. There was no testimony from experts about Ethan's mental health and no records were introduced, but the judge allowed the jury to see excerpts from the teen's handwritten journal. Ethan wrote, quote, I have zero help for my mental problems and it's causing me to shoot up the school. I want help, but my parents don't listen to me, so I can't get any help, end of quote. Now 17, he is serving a life sentence with no chance for parole. After Judge Cheryl Matthews lifted a gag order that had prevented lawyers from speaking to reporters, Jennifer Crumbley's attorney Shannon Smith declined to comment Thursday night, saying the community needs time to heal. The father of one victim said after the verdict that more must be done to address gun violence. Steve St. Juliana said, quote, our children are dying on a daily basis in mass murders and we do very little about it. We complain about Second Amendment rights or we say, well, there's not enough money for mental health issues. We do not want any other parents to go through what we have gone through, end of quote. Yeah, and I say that this is a good verdict, and we'll see what happens at sentencing, which is going to be coming up pretty soon. And it's also very good that the state of Michigan has now passed the laws that they have regarding gun access and locking up your guns, because now that'll help prosecute parents even further if their kid goes out, takes their gun, and kills somebody or a bunch of people. Right now, let's go ahead to our next story. This is Michael R. Sizak writing for the Associated Press. This is dated March 18th out of New York City. This is great news. Donald Trump's lawyers told a New York appellate court Monday that it's impossible for him to post a bond covering the full amount of a $454 million civil fraud judgment while he appeals, suggesting that Trump's legal losses have put him in a serious cash crunch. Once again, the AP refers to Trump as former president. We do not do that on this show. Trump's lawyers wrote in a court filing that, quote, obtaining an appeal bond in the full amount of the judgment is not possible under the circumstances presented, end of quote. Trump claimed last year that he has fairly substantially over $400 million in cash, but back-to-back courtroom defeats have pushed his legal debt north of $500 million. Citing rejections from more than 30 bond underwriters, Trump's lawyers asked the state's intermediate appeals court to reverse a prior ruling requiring that he post a bond covering the full amount in order to halt enforcement while he appeals the judgment in New York Attorney General Letitia James's lawsuit. Trump's financial constraints are being laid bare as he appeals Judge Arthur Engeron's February 16th ruling that he and his co-defendants schemed for years to deceive banks and insurers by inflating his wealth on financial statements used to secure loans and make deals. If the appeals court does not intervene, James can seek to enforce the judgment starting March 25th. James, a Democrat, has said that she will seek to seize some of Trump's assets if he's unable to pay. With interest, Trump owes the state $456.8 million. That amount is increasing nearly $112,000 each day. In all, he and his co-defendants, including his company sons Eric and Donald Trump Jr. and other executives, owe $467.3 million. To obtain a bond, they would be required to post collateral covering 120% of the judgment, or about $557.5 million, according to Trump's lawyers. Trump maintains that he is worth several billion dollars, but much of his wealth is tied up in his skyscrapers, golf courses, and other properties. Oh, really? He's worth billions and billions of dollars. We're finding out that that may not necessarily be true. Few underwriters were willing to issue such a large bond, and none would accept Trump's real estate assets as collateral, instead requiring cash or cash equivalents such as stocks or bonds, according to his lawyers. Trump's lawyers said freeing up cash by offloading some of Trump's properties in a fire sale would be impractical because such cut-rate deals would result in massive, irrevocable losses. Hey, that's fine with me. Not mentioned in Trump's court filings Monday was the presumptive Republican presidential nominee's potential financial windfall from a looming deal to put his social media company, Trump Media and Technology Group, on the stock market under the ticker symbol DJT. I can't wait till we get rid of those initials for good. In everything, in media, in the stock market, in business, in life. A shareholder meeting is scheduled for Friday. If the deal is approved, Trump would own at least 58% of shares in the company, which runs his Truth Social platform. Depending on share price, that could be worth several $billion. Trump is asking a full panel of the Intermediate Appeals Court, the appellate division of the state's trial court, to stay the Engeron judgment while he appeals. His lawyers previously proposed a $100 million bond, but appellate division Judge Anil C. Singh rejected that after an emergency hearing on February 28th. A stay is a legal mechanism pausing collection of a judgment during an appeal. In a court filing last week, Senior Assistant Solicitor General Dennis Fan urged the full appellate panel to reject what he dubbed the defense's "trust us" argument, contending that without a bond to secure the judgment, Trump may attempt to evade enforcement at a later date and force the state to expend substantial public resources to collect the money owed. A full bond is necessary, Fan wrote, in part because Trump's lawyers, quote, have never demonstrated that Mr. Trump's liquid assets, which may fluctuate over time, will be enough to satisfy the full amount of this judgment following appeal, end of quote. Trump's lawyers asked the appellate division panel to consider oral arguments on his request and preemptively sought permission to appeal a losing result to the state's highest court, the Court of Appeals. Singh did grant some of Trump's requests, including pausing a 3-year ban on him seeking loans from New York banks. In their court filing Monday, Trump's lawyers did not address whether they have sought a bank loan to cover the cost of the judgment or obtain cash for use as bond collateral. Trump appealed on February 26th, a few days after Engeron's judgment was made official. His lawyers have asked the appellate division to decide whether Engoron, quote, committed errors of law and or fact, end of quote, and whether he abused his discretion or acted in excess of his jurisdiction. Trump wasn't required to pay his penalty or post a bond in order to appeal, and filing the appeal did not automatically halt enforcement of the judgment. Trump would receive an automatic stay if he were to put up money, assets, or an appeal bond covering what he owes. Gary Giuletti, an insurance broker friend enlisted by Trump to help obtain an appeal bond, wrote in an affidavit Monday, quote, "A bond of this size is rarely if ever seen. In the unusual circumstance that a bond of this size is issued, it is provided to the largest public companies in the world, not to individuals or privately held businesses," end of quote. Giuletti, who acts as an insurance broker for Trump's company, testified at the civil fraud trial as an expert witness called by Trump's lawyers. In his ruling, Engoron observed that some of Giulietti's testimony was contradicted by other witnesses, including a different defense expert. He noted that Giulietti's company collected $1.2 million in commissions on its Trump accounts in 2022. In all, Trump has more than $543 million in personal legal liabilities from 3 civil court judgments in the past year. Bonding requirements could add at least another $100 million to that total. In January, a jury ordered Trump to pay $83.3 million to writer E. Jean Carroll for defaming her after she accused him in 2019 of sexually assaulting her in a Manhattan department store in the 1990s. Earlier this month, after his lawyers made similar arguments that he be excused from posting a bond, Trump did secure a $91.6 million bond to cover 110% of the Carroll judgment while he appeals. Last year, a jury ordered Trump to pay Carroll $5 million in a related trial. In that case, rather than post a bond, Trump put more than $5.5 million in cash in an escrow account while he appeals. And by the way, Trump still has 4 criminal cases ahead of him. I just love this. This is great news. Oh, I wish Trump would just go to prison. Please, be done. Get him over with. Let's go ahead to our next story. Since we're talking about the courts, let's get to the Supreme Court and the new Texas law, Senate Bill 4. This is Lindsay Whitehurst writing for the Associated Press. This is dated March 20th. A federal appeals court late Tuesday issued an order that again prevents Texas from arresting migrants suspected of entering the U.S. illegally, hours after the Supreme Court allowed the strict new immigration law to take effect. The decision by the Fifth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals comes weeks after a panel on the same court cleared the way for Texas to enforce the law by putting a pause on a lower judge's injunction. But by a 2-to-1 order, a panel of the appeals court lifted that pause ahead of arguments before the court on Wednesday. Texas authorities had not announced any arrests made under the law. Earlier Tuesday, a divided Supreme Court had allowed Texas to begin enforcing a law that gives police broad powers to arrest migrants suspected of crossing the border illegally as the legal battle over the measure played out. The conservative majority order rejected an emergency application from the Biden administration, which says the law is a clear-cut violation of federal authority that would cause chaos in immigration law. Texas Governor Greg Abbott had praised the order clearing the way for the law that allows any police officer in Texas to arrest migrants for illegal entry and authorizes judges to order them to leave the U.S. The High Court didn't address whether the law is constitutional. The measure was sent to the appellate court, which made the late Tuesday ruling. It was also unclear whether any migrants ordered to leave might go if the law is ultimately allowed. It calls for them to be sent to ports of entry along the U.S.-Mexico border, even if they are not Mexican citizens. But Mexico's government said Tuesday it would not, under any circumstances, accept the return of any migrants to its territory from the state of Texas. Mexico is not required to accept deportations of anyone except Mexican citizens. The Department of Homeland Security said the federal government would also continue the court challenge to the law that will further complicate the job of its already strained workforce. The agency won't assist in any efforts to enforce the law known as Senate Bill 4. The Supreme Court's majority did not write a detailed opinion in the case, as is typical in emergency appeals, but the decision to let the law go into effect drew dissents from liberal justices Ketanji Brown Jackson, Elena Kagan, and Sonia Sotomayor. Sotomayor wrote in a blistering dissent joined by Jackson, quote, "The court gives a green light to a law that will upend the long-standing federal-state balance of power and sows chaos," end of quote. The law is considered by opponents to be the most dramatic attempt by a state to police immigration since an Arizona law more than a decade ago, portions of which were struck down by the Supreme Court. Critics have also said the Texas law could lead to civil rights violations and racial profiling. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre called the law, quote, "harmful and unconstitutional," end of quote, and said it would burden law enforcement while creating confusion. She called on congressional Republicans to settle the issue with a federal border security law. Texas, for its part, has argued it has a right to take action over what authorities have called an ongoing crisis at the southern border. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice said in a statement it is prepared to handle any influx in the state's detainee population associated with the state law. Sheriff's offices have been preparing for the implementation of Senate Bill 4 since the state's legislative session last year. That is according to Skylar Hearn, executive director of the Sheriff's Association of Texas. The law allows police in counties bordering Mexico to make arrests if they see someone crossing illegally, he said. It could also be enforced elsewhere in Texas if someone is arrested on suspicion of another violation and a fingerprint taken during jail booking links them to a suspected reentry violation. He added that it would likely not come into play during a routine traffic stop. Hearn said, quote, "I don't think you will see anything ultimately different," end of quote. Arrests for illegal crossings along the southern border hit record highs in December, but fell by half in January, a shift attributed to seasonal declines and heightened enforcement. The federal government has not yet released numbers for February. Some Texas officials sounded a cautious note. Sheriff Eddie Guerra of Hidalgo County said, quote, "A lot of the police chiefs here, we don't believe it will survive a constitutional challenge. We have no training whatsoever to determine whether an individual is here in this country legally," end of quote. Guerra serves as president of the Southwestern Border Sheriffs Coalition, representing 31 border counties from Texas to California. Conservative Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett suggested her vote in favor of Texas stemmed from the technicalities of the appeals process rather than agreement with the state on the substance of the law. In a concurring opinion joined by fellow conservative Justice Brett Kavanaugh, she wrote this, quote, "So far as I know, this court has never reviewed the decision of a court of appeals to enter or not enter an administrative stay. I would not get into the business. When entered, an administrative stay is supposed to be a short-lived prelude to the main event, a ruling on the motion for a stay pending appeal," end of quote. The battle over the Texas immigration law is one of multiple legal disputes between Texas officials and the Biden administration over how far the state can go to patrol the Texas-Mexico border and prevent illegal border crossings. Several Republican governors have backed Governor Abbott's efforts, saying the federal government is not doing enough to enforce existing immigration laws. The Supreme Court in 2012 struck down key parts of an Arizona law that would have allowed police to arrest people for federal immigration violations, often referred to by opponents as the Show Me Your Papers bill. The divided high court found then that the impasse in Washington over immigration reform did not justify state intrusion. And that's what the Supreme Court should ultimately decide and rule in favor of. That this is not a state issue, this is a federal issue. So the Supreme Court said that the enforcement could start. Now the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals says, nope, you can't start it. So here we go. We will be following this story for the next several months as long as the Supreme Court is going to be looking at the arguments of the case and whether or not they make a decision on it. Let's get to our next story. This is the Associated Press writing for March 20th out of Atlanta. The judge overseeing the Georgia election interference case is allowing Donald Trump to appeal the ruling letting Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis remain on the prosecution. Superior Court Judge Scott McAfee on Wednesday granted a request by defense attorneys to ask the Georgia Court of Appeals to review the judge's decision. It's now up to the appeals court to decide whether the court will hear it. McAfee, in a ruling last week, denied the defense's request to disqualify Willis from the case or dismiss the indictment over her romantic relationship with Special Prosecutor Nathan Wade. The judge said Willis can remain on the case as long as Wade resigns, which he did on Friday. But the judge also rebuked Willis for her tremendous lapse in judgment and questioned the truthfulness of Wade's and her testimony about the timing of their relationship. Wade's resignation allowed Willis to remain on the most sprawling of 4 criminal cases against the presumptive Republican nominee in the 2024 presidential election. But the long-term damage to the public perception of the prosecution remains unclear, particularly in light of Trump's relentless barrage of attacks on the pair who pledged to hold Trump accountable but found their own actions under a public microscope. Wade offered his resignation in a letter to Willis, saying he was doing so, quote, in the interest of democracy, in dedication to the American public, and to move this case forward as quickly as possible, end of quote. Willis wrote, quote, I will always remember and will remind everyone that you were brave enough to step forward and take on the investigation and the prosecution of the allegations that the defendants in this case engaged in a conspiracy to overturn Georgia's 2020 presidential election, end of quote. Trump's team felt differently. In a social media post, Trump said the Fani Willis lover had, quote, resigned in disgrace, end of quote. And Trump repeated his assertion that the case is an effort to hurt his campaign to reclaim the White House in November. Trump has denied anything wrong and pled not guilty. Yeah. Oh, I never did anything wrong. That's Donald Trump's consistent refrain. He's like a broken record that keeps skipping. I never did anything wrong. It's a witch hunt. It's this, it's that, it's the other. No, Donald Trump, it's bullshit what you say, because it's all lies. You are a liar, a renowned liar, the most renowned liar in the history of planet Earth. Attorneys for Trump and the other defendants had said a failure to remove Willis could imperil any convictions and force a retrial if an appeals court later finds it was warranted. They wrote, quote, neither the court nor the parties should run an unnecessary risk of having to go through that process more than once, end of quote. So there's the latest on the Georgia 2020 election fraud case. God, I wish Trump would just get convicted and go to prison already. Good Lord. You people that continue to support Trump when 2024 is over with, I'm going to have 4 magic words for you, and those are, I told you so. Once again, I'll be saying, I told you so. Unbelievable. And it's people like my aunt in Kentucky, my middle brother, who just goes on Trump tirade after Trump tirade. Oh, he's the smartest man ever. Whatever. No, my brother's been brainwashed by religion, by the Reformed Church. Oh, well. Tell you what, let's get into our next story here. This is the Associated Press. Morgan Lee and Nicholas Riccardi writing for the AP. This is dated March 19th out of Santa Fe, New Mexico. 2 recent Supreme Court actions have opened the door to a new legal frontier in which local and state officials can be disqualified from office for life for engaging in insurrection or providing aid and comfort to enemies of the Constitution based on a post-Civil War era addition to the nation's foundational legal document and how the courts interpret it. The U.S. Supreme Court on Monday rejected an appeal from a former New Mexico County Commissioner who was kicked out of office after he was convicted of trespassing during the January 6, 2021 traitorous attack on the U.S. Capitol. I added traitorous because that's what those people were, are, and they still are. They are traitors. The state judge who barred him from office did so on the grounds that his actions violated Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which was added to the Constitution in 1868 to prevent Confederates from returning to government. The move came on the heels of an expedited high court ruling that Section 3 cannot be used against federal officials or candidates until Congress writes a law outlining procedures to do so. That includes Donald Trump, the target of a national campaign to end his bid to return to the White House via the 14th Amendment. But the court's ruling in the Trump case explicitly said the provision could still be used against state and local officials. Taken together, the actions herald a new legal landscape as the liberal groups that push the issue of Trump's disqualification to the Supreme Court reboot efforts to target state and local officials linked to January 6th. Stuart McPhail, an attorney with Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, a left-leaning group whose lawsuit against Trump ended up at the Supreme Court, said, quote, "This is a bit of returning to the course we expected to be following, which was holding individuals accountable who are low-level officials who still broke their oath by coming to D.C. engaging in insurrection," end of quote. Ron Fain, legal director of Free Speech for People, which brought several other actions seeking to disqualify Trump and Republican members of Congress for their role in the Capitol attack, wouldn't comment on his group's plans, but he said one legal fact remains clear. He said, quote, "Section 3 continues to be a viable way of protecting against insurrectionists in state and local government," end of quote. Crew, which brought the lawsuit against Trump's candidacy that landed at the Supreme Court, has identified state lawmakers it believes might be vulnerable to challenges under Section 3. It already has succeeded in one case brought against the local official in New Mexico. Otero County Commissioner Coy Griffin, a founder of the promotional group Cowboys for Trump, is the only elected official thus far to be banned from office in connection with the Capitol attack, which disrupted Congress as it was trying to certify Joe Biden's 2020 electoral victory over Trump. The lawsuit against him cited his violation of Section 3, which prohibits anyone who swore an oath to uphold the Constitution and then engaged in insurrection or rebellion against it or gave aid and comfort to its enemies from holding future office. McPhail said there was a new sense of urgency to take action under that clause against state or local officials linked to January 6th before they run for federal office and cannot be sidelined. He said, quote, "It does create this incentive to bring cases from low-level officials now because then you can actually win them and get some kind of relief in judgments, whereas if you wait, you may have lost the opportunity," end of quote. Based on the Supreme Court's ruling in the Trump disqualification case, a state or a local official removed under Section 3 could still hold federal office all the way up to president unless Congress acted. Griffin said his disqualification was politically motivated. He and his defense attorney said Monday's dismissal by the Supreme Court holds ominous implications, creating a pathway for partisan actors to harness Section 3 of the 14th Amendment in unpredictable ways in the future. Peter Tickton, Griffin's attorney in the appeal to the Supreme Court, said, quote, "All you have to do is go to a really friendly county with a good friendly judge that's politically on your side, and then you get rid of your opposition," end of quote. Derek Muller, a Notre Dame law professor, said he wouldn't be surprised if Section 3 litigation eventually targets people for reasons well beyond January 6th. He said, quote, "I don't know how widespread it's going to be. I'm sure people are going to start thinking creatively about what it means if you're supporting Hamas, the Taliban, Black Lives Matter," end of quote. Mueller added that the court system is well equipped to sort out frivolous uses of Section 3, just as it does in other cases of ballot challenges. Quote, "In most of these cases, I think it won't pass the initial motion to dismiss," end of quote. The bigger question, he said, is how do courts address issues that the Supreme Court dodged in its ruling on the Trump case? What constitutes an insurrection under Section 3? How do First Amendment rights and other constitutional guarantees interact with its provisions? In Griffin's case, New Mexico Judge Francis Matthew found that Griffin aided an insurrection without engaging in violence, contributing to a delay in Congress's certification of the presidential election. He ruled that Griffin spread lies about the 2020 election being stolen from Trump in a series of speeches during rallies held across the country, calling on crowds to go with him to Washington on January 6th and join the war over the presidential election results. Matthew ruled, quote, Knowledgeable 19th century Americans, including Section 3's framers, would have regarded the events of January 6th and the surrounding planning, mobilization, and incitement as an insurrection. Mr. Griffin also incited, encouraged, and helped normalize the violence on January 6th. End of quote. Griffin, a Republican, was convicted separately in federal court of entering a restricted area on the Capitol grounds on January 6th and received a 14-day prison sentence. The sentence was offset by time served after his arrest in Washington, where he had returned to protest Biden's 2021 inauguration. That conviction is under appeal, but is unlikely to influence enforcement of Griffin's ban from office. Judge Matthew wrote, quote, "Neither the courts nor Congress have ever required a criminal conviction for a person to be disqualified under Section 3. End of quote. Crew brought the case against Griffin partly because New Mexico is one of several states that allow any citizen to bring a private right of action to establish that an election official is not qualified to hold office. In states that lack such provisions, attorneys note, those who want to remove people under Section 3 may have other paths, such as ballot challenges filed with the Secretary of State or an election board. McPhail said, quote, "There is no one-size-fits-all solution for enforcing Section 3 in the states." End of quote. So, yeah, there you go, folks. This is good news. Keep the violent, evil, conservative traitors out of office. Period. End of story. Right now, let's go ahead and let's shift gears to the Israeli-Gaza war and some comments made by Jared Kushner recently. This is Megan Kennard writing for the Associated Press. This is dated March 19th out of Columbia, South Carolina. Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's former White House advisor and his son-in-law, praised the very valuable potential of Gaza's waterfront property, suggesting that Israel should remove civilians while it cleans up the area. Wow. Listen to this. In an interview dated February 15th, posted earlier this month on the YouTube channel of the Middle East Initiative, a program of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and reported first on Tuesday by The Guardian, good on The Guardian, Kushner said, quote, "Gaza's waterfront property, it could be very valuable if people would focus on building up livelihoods. If you think about all the money that's gone into this tunnel network and into all the munitions, if that would have gone into education or innovation, what could have been done?" End of quote. Kushner continued, quote, "It's a little bit of an unfortunate situation there, but I think from Israel's perspective, I would do my best to move the people out and then clean it up. But I don't think that Israel has stated that they don't want the people to move back there afterwards." End of quote. So could this be another factor for Israel wiping out Palestine? Could they be seeing some monetary issues here? I would think so, especially based on Kushner's comments. Kushner posted a video of the entire interaction, responding Tuesday on X to, quote, "those dishonestly using selected parts," end of quote, of his remarks. He said that he stood by his comments and, quote, "believe the Palestinian people's lives will improve only when the international community and their citizenry start demanding accountability from their leadership," end of quote. About 1.5 million displaced Palestinians are sheltering in the southern Gaza town of Rafah as Israel looks to eliminate Hamas following the militant group's deadly October 7th attack. More than 30,000 Palestinians have been killed and over 70,000 wounded in the Gaza Strip since Israel's war on Hamas began. Let me add the number of journalists who have been killed and injured reporting on this war, which is being done to silence them. Don't think it ain't. And Benjamin Netanyahu is all behind this. Benjamin Netanyahu is Israel's equivalent of Donald John Trump. Period. End of story. On Monday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu agreed to send a team of Israeli officials to Washington to discuss a prospective Rafah operation with Biden administration officials. The agreement to hold such talks came as President Joe Biden and Netanyahu spoke Monday, their first interaction in more than a month, as the divide has grown between allies over the food crisis in Gaza and Israel's conduct during the war, according to the White House. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said the talks will happen in the coming days and are expected to involve military, intelligence, and humanitarian experts. In the interview last month, Kushner also suggested that getting civilians out of Rafah and potentially into Egypt might be possible, quote, with the right diplomacy, end of quote, also posting a plan for the Negev desert in southern Israel. With the right diplomacy. Oh, my God, really? Yeah, that's dog whistle for bomb the hell out of them. Sorry, that's my opinion. Additionally, Kushner suggested that he, quote, would just bulldoze something in the Negev. I would try to move people in there, end of quote. Adding, quote, I know that won't be the popular thing to do, but I think that's a better option to do so you can go in and finish the job. I think Israel's gone way more out of their way than a lot of other countries would to try to protect civilians from casualties, end of quote. Really? I say bullshit to that. They have gone out of their way to kill civilians and, as I said, reporters. If you don't believe me, look at the numbers. Unbelievable. The debate over the Israel-Hamas war has developed into a major theme of this year's U.S. presidential election, drawing dividing lines between Biden and Trump, as well as within their own parties. Asked in an interview Monday about Democrats' growing criticism of Netanyahu over his handling of the war in Gaza, Trump charged that Jews who vote for Democrats, quote, hate Israel, end of quote, and hate their religion, igniting a firestorm of criticism from the White House and Jewish leaders. He doubled down on those remarks Tuesday, telling reporters in Florida that, quote, the Democrats have been very, very opposed to Jewish people, end of quote. Senator Chuck Schumer, Democrat of New York, meanwhile gave a speech from the Senate floor calling Trump's comments, quote, utterly disgusting and a textbook example of the kind of anti-Semitism facing Jews, end of quote. Kushner worked on a wide range of issues and policies in the Trump administration, including Middle East peace efforts, noting that he is not interested in rejoining the White House if Trump, who last week became the presumptive GOP nominee, wins the 2024 presidential election. Kushner said last month that he was focused on his investment business and his living with his family in Florida out of the public eye. So what he wants to do, Jared Kushner does, is he wants to help mop up the Israel-Gaza war by investing his money into property, oceanfront property in the Gaza Strip in hopes of developing it and having Jewish people, Israelis, living there instead of Palestinians whose land were stolen from them back in 1947. Sorry, that's the way it is. The British helped them with it. The United Nations helped them with it. They got rid of the Palestinians and they put Israel in place. All you got to do is look at your history, folks. Crack open a history book. Not one made in this country. Get one made in England or elsewhere because they tell the truth. You don't get the truth in textbooks in this country. You really don't. Not with the textbook companies that are out there, especially the ones in Texas. You know, it's like the textbook saying that the slaves were better off being here because they learned a new skill. Give me a break. Unbelievable. Absolutely disgusting. Speaking of disgusting, let's continue and let's get into the story about Donald Trump saying that Jews who vote for Democrats hate Israel. This is Jill Colvin writing for the Associated Press. This is dated March 19th out of New York. Donald Trump on Monday charged the Jews who vote for Democrats hate Israel and hate their religion, igniting a firestorm of criticism from the White House and Jewish leaders. In an interview, Trump had been asked about Democrats' growing criticism of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over his handling of the war in Gaza as the civilian death toll continues to mount. In an interview with his former aide Sebastian Gorka, Remember, they're getting rid of your hamburgers. Hamburgers. Not hamburgers, hamburgers. Because Sebastian Gorka's another fucking idiot. Trump responded, quote, I actually think they hate Israel. I think they hate Israel, and the Democratic Party hates Israel. End of quote. Trump, who last week became the Republican Party's presumptive nominee, went on to charge, quote, any Jewish person that votes for Democrats hates their religion. They hate everything about Israel, and they should be ashamed of themselves because Israel will be destroyed. End of quote. The comments sparked immediate backlash from the White House, President Biden's campaign, and Jewish leaders. The vast majority of Jewish Americans identify as Democrats, but Trump has often accused them of disloyalty, perpetuating what critics say is an anti-Semitic trope. At the White House, spokesperson Andrew Bates cast the comments as, quote, vile and unhinged anti-Semitic rhetoric, end of quote, without mentioning Trump by name. He said, quote, as anti-Semitic crimes and acts of hate have increased against the world, among them the deadliest attack committed against the Jewish people since the Holocaust, leaders have an obligation to call hate what it is and bring Americans together against it. There is no justification for spreading toxic false stereotypes that threaten fellow citizens, end of quote. Biden's campaign said, quote, the only person who should be ashamed here is Donald Trump, end of quote. You guarantee that's right. Absolutely. Spokesman James Singer said, quote, Trump is going to lose again this November because Americans are sick of his hateful resentment, personal attacks, and extreme agenda, end of quote. God, I hope so. Get out and vote, people. And you know who to vote for, and it ain't Trump. Oh, I don't know how else I can put it. It's really that simple. Jonathan Greenblatt, who heads the Anti-Defamation League, said, quote, accusing Jews of hating their religion because they might vote for a particular party is defamatory and patently false, end of quote. He added on X, formerly known as Twitter, quote, serious leaders who care about the historic U.S.-Israel alliance should focus on strengthening rather than unraveling bipartisan support for the state of Israel, end of quote. Trump's comments come as Biden has been facing mounting pressure from the progressive wing of his party over his administration's support for Israel in its retaliatory offensive in Gaza. Over 30,000 Palestinians have been killed since Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, according to the health ministry in the Hamas-ruled territory. While Biden continues to back Israel's right to defend itself, he has increasingly criticized Netanyahu. After his State of the Union speech, he said he needed to have a come-to-Jesus conversation with the Israeli leader. He also accused Netanyahu of, quote, hurting Israel more than helping Israel, end of quote, adding that, quote, he must pay more attention to the innocent lives being lost as a consequence of the actions taken, end of quote. Trump took particular issue with recent comments from Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, the country's highest-ranking Jewish official. In a speech last week, Schumer sharply criticized Netanyahu's handling of the war in Gaza, warning that the civilian toll was damaging Israel's standing around the world. He also called for Israel to hold new elections. While the White House formally distanced itself from Schumer's comments, the Democratic leader and key ally was voicing an opinion increasingly held across Biden's administration. Schumer, whom Trump accused of being, quote, very anti-Israel now, end of quote, responded by accusing Trump of, quote, making highly partisan and hateful rants, end of quote. He wrote on X, quote, to make Israel a partisan issue only hurts Israel and the U.S.-Israeli relationship, end of quote. The Pew Research Center reported in 2021 that Jews are, quote, among the most consistently liberal and democratic groups in the U.S., end of quote, with 7 in 10 Jewish adults identifying with or leaning toward the Democratic Party. In 2020, it found that nearly 3/4 of American Jews disapproved of Trump's performance as president, with just 27% rating him positively. Americans have also increasingly soured on Israel's military operation in Gaza, according to surveys from the Associated Press and the Nork Center for Public Affairs Research. In January, 50% of U.S. adults said the military response from Israel in the Gaza Strip had gone too far, up from 40% just 2 months earlier. That number was higher among Democrats, 6 in 10 of whom said the same thing in both surveys. So there you go. And I've got one final story that I want to get to. This is Marshall Cohen writing for CNN. This is dated March 18th. This is some good news, finally. A pro-Trump lawyer who tried to overturn the 2020 election was arrested Monday after a court hearing about her recent leak of internal emails belonging to Dominion Voting Systems. There was an existing arrest warrant for attorney Stephanie Lambert stemming from her failure to appear at recent court hearings in her separate criminal case in Michigan, where she was charged with conspiring to seize voting machines after the 2020 election. Lambert and a cadre of election deniers have disrupted one of Dominion's many ongoing defamation lawsuits by publicly leaking thousands of the company's internal emails in recent days, using the disclosures to resurrect false claims about voter fraud. The controversy erupted when Lambert provided the confidential Dominion documents to Barry County Sheriff Darren Leaf, who has embraced conspiracy theories about the 2020 election and has used his office to hunt for supposed voter fraud against Donald Trump. In the last 24 hours, Leaf has posted more than 2,000 internal Dominion documents on his social media account. For that, Darleaf receives Douchebag of the Week once again on this very show. We might as well make it official.
Stop! Hammer time!
Yes, it is hammer time. Time to drop the hammer on the Douchebag of the Week, and that is Barry County, Michigan Sheriff Darleaf. Him and his fat ass. And I'm sick of it. Governor Gretchen Whitmer, you need to remove him from office now. Get a complaint and get it done now. For that matter, we'll give Stephanie Lambert Douchebag of the Week as well. Lambert had access to the Dominion files because she represents former Overstock CEO Patrick Byrne, who is being sued for defamation by the voting company over his 2020 election lies. As part of the case, they have access to discovery from Dominion, whose lawyers said they have already turned over more than 1 million documents. Lambert attended a hearing Monday in Byrne's defamation case in Washington, D.C., but was never seen leaving the courtroom, and questions swirled among the other attorneys about whether she had been taken into custody. The judge told Lambert to stay behind as the hearing wrapped up. The other attorneys left the courtroom, and 2 federal marshals then went inside and locked the doors. Lambert was never seen exiting the courtroom. The marshals declined to say whether they arrested her, and she didn't answer messages seeking comment after the hearing. The U.S. Marshal Service confirmed in a statement late Monday that Lambert was arrested. In a statement referring to her Michigan-based criminal case, the Marshal Service said, quote, "We can confirm the arrest of Stephanie Lambert earlier this afternoon. Lambert is currently being held on local charges," end of quote. The Dominion leaks have, at least for now, diverted attention away from the alleged 2020 election-related defamation. More hearings will be needed to deal with the matter and for the judge to consider potential consequences for Lambert. And I'd get some consequences on Darleaf as well. Dominion's lawyers also said in filings that company employees are already receiving new death threats in the wake of the disclosures. The messages posted online by Darleaf contain names, email addresses, cell phone numbers, and office addresses of Dominion employees. During the at-times testy hearing Monday, Magistrate Judge Maxilla Upadhyaya peppered Lambert with sharp questions about the disputed Dominion materials. The judge ordered that Lambert be restricted from accessing the database containing the Dominion documents. The judge said, quote, "I will deal with the why later, but for now I need to preserve the status quo," end of quote, adding that, quote, "we need to prevent any future dissemination," end of quote. The judge said there would be a future hearing to determine whether Lambert violated a court order by leaking the Dominion files, and that Byrne would need to appear and answer questions. Dominion wants Lambert removed from the case and suggested in court Monday that she might have committed a crime by disseminating the files to Leaf. Lambert, Leaf, and Byrne have claimed in court filings and public statements that the documents they disclosed contain evidence that Serbian nationals meddled in the 2020 election at Dominion's request. Oh, really? Yeah. A Dominion spokesperson told CNN after the hearing, quote, "As has been public for years, Dominion has a small staff presence in Serbia, but any allegation that Dominion employees anywhere tried to interfere with any election is flatly false," end of quote. During the hearing, Lambert admitted that she gave the materials to Leaf, though she said that she was allowed to because she was reporting a crime to law enforcement. She also called on Congress to investigate her claim that foreign nationals interfered with the 2020 election, which the U.S. Intelligence Committee has said was the most secure ever. Lambert told the judge, quote, "I did turn the documents over to law enforcement," end of quote. Dominion blasted Lambert and Byrne in court filings here before the hearing, saying that their claims of Serbian meddling in the U.S. election were xenophobic, and noting that Lambert was nearly sanctioned for her role in a frivolous conspiracy-laden election lawsuit. Dominion lawyer Davida Brooks said in court Monday, quote, "It's been nearly 4 years. When does it stop?" End of quote. She accused Lambert and Byrne of, quote, "using these lawsuits to spread more lies," end of quote. Dominion is suing several other pro-Trump figures who peddled similar lies about the 2020 election, including former Trump lawyers Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell and right-wing cable news networks Newsmax and One America News. Dominion settled a defamation lawsuit against Fox Propaganda Channel last year for $787 million in the largest publicly known defamation settlement in U.S. history. So to Stephanie Lambert and Berry County Sheriff Darleaf, we have this message for you.
Don't be a douchebag.
Yeah, you got that right. Especially that fat-ass Darleaf. Oh my God, I can't stand Darleaf. Leaf is a militia-loving son of a bitch. He really is, folks. This guy needs to go bye-bye from his office. I once again plead to Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, you need to remove Darleaf from office now before he leaks any more documents and breaks any more laws. He's broken the law. Why is he in law enforcement? Really? That's it for this week. We'll be back next week. I'm Darren Gibson. Please support independent media, the First Amendment, and a woman's right to choose.
The stations that carry Southpaws do not necessarily share the opinions expressed on the show. Southpaws is protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and is copyrighted by Big D Entertainment. All rights reserved.